Right, so let's dive into something pretty wild. Everyone's been talking about these airtight sanctions on Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Turns out there might be a few leaks.
Oh.
And the source of those leaks might surprise you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, really.
Really?
Investigate Europe, a team known for their cross-border investigations, dug into this, and they found a trail of airplane parts floating from the West to Russia, with India as the unexpected middleman.
You'd think after Boeing and Airbus very publicly cut ties with Russia, things would be shut down tight.
Right.
But the investigation uncovered something else entirely.
Yes, they did. They analyzed customs data and tracked over 700 shipments worth over $50 million of aircraft parts going from Western companies to India and then on to Russia.
Wow.
And we're not just talking about, obscure components. These are generators, sensors, propeller blades,
Wow.
even seemingly insignificant things like screws and bolts all making their way to Russian airlines and firms, including Aeroflot.
Hold on. So even with all the sanctions and public pressure, these crucial parts are still reaching Russia.
Yes.
How are they pulling that off?
Well, that's where the network of Indian intermediaries comes in.
Okay.
These companies act as a bridge between Western suppliers and Russian buyers, often obscuring the final destination of the parts.
Oh.
One company that really stood out in the investigation was Aerotrust Aviation, based in Delhi.
Aerotrust.
They seemed to appear out of nowhere in late 2021 and quickly became a major player in the Russian market.
Okay, Aerotrust, that name rings a bell. Weren't they sending millions of dollars worth of parts to Russia, many of which could be traced back to big names like Boeing and Airbus?
That's right, and their main client was Aeroflot.
Oh, wow.
Which adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. After all, Aeroflot is Russia's flagship airline, a state-owned company. So even if Western suppliers weren't directly selling to Russia, their parts were indirectly supporting a key Russian entity.
So what you're saying is it's like a shell game, right? Parts change hands a few times and suddenly they're in Russia despite all the sanctions and supposed restrictions.
Exactly. And it's not just Aerotrust. The investigation also highlighted another Indian firm called Ascend Aviation. They were receiving shipments from Boeing, Airbus, and other Western companies and then re-exporting them to Russian buyers. And the U.S. government actually sanctioned Ascend in late 2024 for its role in sanctions evasion. But here's the thing. There's no evidence to suggest that Boeing or Airbus were knowingly letting their products slip through the cracks.
That's where it gets tricky, right? Proving intent in these cases must be incredibly difficult.
It is.
I mean, these supply chains are so complex.
Yes.
With parts changing hands multiple times.
Exactly.
How could you definitively say that a company knew where their products were ultimately going?
It's a real challenge. In some cases, there might be genuine ignorance.
Right.
A company might simply not know the final destination of its parts.
Right.
But in other cases, this lack of visibility could be used as a shield to intentionally circumvent sanctions. It becomes a game of plausible deniability.
I see what you mean. And in this case, the investigation uncovered something really interesting. They found over 200 of the items shipped to Russia fell under the common high-priority goods list.
Right.
What exactly is that?
So it's a list compiled by the G7 that includes goods considered critical to Russian military systems or have been found on the battlefield in Ukraine. We're talking about navigation equipment, generators, radars,
Oh, wow.
and a bunch of smaller mechanical components that could be used in various military applications.
Okay, so now we're not just talking about keeping civilian planes in the air.
Right.
These are parts that could potentially be used to support Russia's military operations in Ukraine.
That's right. And the investigation found specific instances where these high-priority goods made their way to Russia through this network. For example, a hose assembly, which is a component needed for transferring fluids and gases in an aircraft, left Satter's facility in Copenhagen, went to Ascend Aviation in India, and then ended up with Aeroflot.
Wait, didn't you say that Ascend Aviation was sanctioned by the U.S.?
Yeah.
And that Aeroflot is Russia's state-owned airline.
That's correct.
So even with these sanctions in place, parts that could potentially be used by the Russian military are still flipping through.
That's what the data suggests. And what's even more concerning is that the customs code for this particular hose assembly was added to the high priority list just a month before it was shipped. It raises questions about whether someone was trying to exploit a window of opportunity before the restrictions fully tighten.
This whole thing is starting to feel like a spy thriller, isn't it?
Yeah.
Intricate networks, shadowy deals, and potentially crucial military equipment changing hands under the radar.
But certainly an element of intrigue to it, and the investigation didn't stop there. They also dug into a case involving Superjet International, a company initially formed as a joint venture between the Italian defense giant Leonardo and Russia's Sukhoi.
Hold on, an Italian company was mixed up in this too?
Yes.
I thought this was all about Indian intermediaries.
It gets even more complicated. Superjet International is now majority owned by the United Aircraft Corporation, or UAC, which is a Russian company under EU sanctions for its military links. After the invasion of Ukraine, Italian authorities froze all Superjet assets owned by UAC, and Leonardo, which is partly owned by the Italian state, took over temporary management control of Superjet.
So you're saying that even with the Italian government and Leonardo involved, there were still ways for parts to flow from Superjet to Russia?
Precisely. The investigation found that despite these measures, some Superjet products still ended up in Russia, often via India. They tracked a $400,000 side stick unit, which is a critical cockpit component, shipped from Superjet to a company called Alestro Aero Solutions in India, which then re-exported it to Moscow for a UAC-owned company called Repart Services.
Okay, I need to make sure I've got this straight. Alestro Aero Solutions in India buys a part from Superjet, which is partially managed by the Italian government, and then sends that part to a company in Russia that's under EU sanctions. Did I get that right?
You got it. And it doesn't stop there. Report Services, the recipient of that side stick unit, was sanctioned in 2022 for its ties to Russia's defense and security sector. The analysis suggests that they've acquired over $3 million worth of parts from India that originally came from Superjet.
It's incredible how many twists and turns there are in this story. You have to wonder how effective sanctions can really be when there are so many ways to work around them. It makes you think about all the other potential loopholes out there, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And what's even more intriguing is the story of Alestro Aero Solutions itself.
Well, tell me more about them. I'm all ears. So what's the deal with this Alestro Aero Solutions outfit? What's their story?
They're quite the chameleon, actually. Back in 2015, they registered as a garment retailer.
Hmm.
Fast forward to 2023, and boom, they're suddenly in the business of buying and selling aircraft parts. Their corporate accounts show their revenue going through the roof during this time, coinciding with a huge uptick in sales to Russia.
Sounds like they spotted a golden opportunity and grabbed it with both hands. But what do they have to say when confronted with these findings?
Not much surprisingly, they declined to comment on the investigation's findings. A director at another company in the same building as Alestro simply said they were doing perfectly legal business.
Yeah, I bet they did. But this brings up a bigger question. What about the companies that are supposedly upholding the sanctions? What was their reaction to all of this?
Well, the Indian companies at the heart of this network have mostly stayed silent, declining to comment on the investigation's findings. As for Boeing and Airbus, their responses were surprisingly brief. Boeing just reiterated that they had suspended all major operations in Russia back in March 2022, including parts and support services.
That's off the vague considering the evidence presented in the investigation. What did Airbus have to say?
They were similarly tight-lipped. Airbus simply stated they are complying with all laws and regulations and are committed to preventing sanctions circumvention.
It almost sounds like they're trying to wash their hands of the whole thing. If our parts end up in Russia, it's not our fault.
There's definitely a sense of that. They're essentially arguing that they're doing everything by the book, and if there are loopholes being exploited, it's not their responsibility to police the entire global supply chain.
But isn't there a responsibility to at least try to ensure your products aren't contributing to a conflict, especially when there are clear sanctions in place? It can't all be about profits, can it?
It's a complex ethical dilemma, no doubt. On one hand, companies have a responsibility to their shareholders to be profitable, but on the other hand, there's a growing expectation that businesses should also consider the broader social and political implications of their actions.
And in this case, those implications are quite significant. We're talking about a war potential, military applications, and the effectiveness of international sanctions. This whole situation really shines a light on the challenges of enforcing those sanctions in a globalized world.
Absolutely. It's a constant cat-and-mouse game between those imposing the sanctions and those seeking to circumvent them. This investigation has exposed just how intricate and adaptable these networks can be.
It's a bit mind-boggling, really. Who would have thought that something as seemingly mundane as airplane parts could lead us down such a rabbit hole of international intrigue, sanctions busting, and even potential military implications?
It's a reminder that even the smallest components can play a significant role in a much larger geopolitical and economic landscape. And it raises important questions about the effectiveness of sanctions in a globalized world where supply chains are so complex and interconnected.
This has been an eye-opening deep dive. It's amazing what they can uncover when you start peeling back the layers of global trade. What was the most surprising thing you learned from all this?
What struck me the most was the ingenuity and adaptability of these networks. They're constantly evolving, finding new routes and methods to get around obstacles. It highlights the challenges faced by governments and organizations trying to enforce sanctions and maintain control in an increasingly interconnected world.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It makes you wonder about the unintended consequences of these actions and the ripple effects they might have on the global stage.
Exactly, and it underscores the need for ongoing vigilance adaptation and perhaps even a reevaluation of how sanctions are implemented and enforced in the future.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. What stood out most to you in this deep dive? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this exploration illuminating, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating journeys into the world of information.